The cabin had never been so silent. Not during turbulence. Not during delays. Not even during the captain's pre-flight announcements. But now, every heartbeat, every breath, every unsaid word hung in the still air like a storm cloud refusing to break. Owen stood at the back of the plane, a teenager in a hoodie, black, quiet, unwavering. And Bridget, the lead flight attendant, stood in front of him, clutching the very boarding pass she had once dismissed. Her eyes were lowered. Her mouth was trembling. But this time, she had no script, no authority to hide behind. Only the weight of what she had done. I want to apologize, she stammered, voice barely louder than a whisper. There was a misunderstanding. Owen didn't move, didn't blink. His voice came, calm, but cutting like steel wrapped in silk. A misunderstanding? He repeated. The words echoed off the walls. You call being questioned, removed, and humiliated in front of a cabin full of strangers a misunderstanding? Bridget opened her mouth, but nothing came. You didn't see a ticket when you looked at me, Owen continued, louder now. You saw something you didn't think belonged. You didn't verify. You didn't ask. You decided. A baby cried faintly 2 rows back, but even the infant's wail seemed to hush as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Owen looked around, not with desperation, not with a plea, but with expectation. To everyone else who sat here and said nothing, he said, his voice steady, rising. You didn't need to shout. You didn't need to argue. You only needed to say, that's not right. But you didn't. A man in 3C swallowed hard. A woman in 4B bowed her head. You see, silence isn't neutral. It's a choice, Owen said. And today, your choice was heard louder than any words. Bridget's lips quivered. I didn't mean. I know you didn't mean, Owen said, cutting her off. That's the problem. People don't mean harm. But they become harm when they act without thought and assume without truth. The air seemed to thin. Passengers forgot to breathe. Owen stepped forward, past Bridget, down the same aisle he had walked hours earlier in shame, but this time, every step felt like a declaration. Not of revenge, but of reclaiming. Reclaiming space. Dignity. Truth. He stopped beside seat 2A. The book he had been reading, Beloved, by Toni Morrison, was still there. Untouched. As if it had been waiting for him. Owen turned back once more. To every kid who's ever been told they don't belong, because they're young, or black, or dressed wrong, this seat is for you. He sat down, fastened his seatbelt, and opened his book, not to escape, but to own the space he'd earned. Bridget stood frozen. She had seen turbulence at 40,000 feet, but nothing like the storm she had caused at ground level. A voice came from the cockpit speaker. Cabin secure for takeoff. But this flight wasn't just leaving the tarmac. It was leaving behind the era of pretending nothing happened. The engine roared to life beneath them, a low hum that rippled through the cabin like the breath of something awakening, not just the plane, but something inside every witness on board. Owen sat quietly in 2A. He didn't need applause. He didn't need vindication. What he had done wasn't for the cabin. It was for every boy like him who had been asked to move without question. For every seat taken, not because of error, but because of assumption. He turned the page in his book. Across the aisle, the man in 2B, white, early 40s, a lawyer judging by the leather briefcase tucked at his feet, watched him. He had been there. Silent. Still. And now, uncomfortable. I should have said something, the man whispered. Owen didn't look up. You still can, he replied simply. And with that, the man nodded and turned, this time not away from the truth, but toward it. Further back, Taylor stood in the galley, fingers gripping the edge of the counter. Her eyes were wet, but her resolve was clear. She had stayed quiet when it mattered most. But now, she would not be silent again. Bridget was gone, removed from the flight quietly minutes earlier. No words. No protest. No ceremony. Just a woman stepping off a plane and into the consequences of the person she'd allowed herself to become. The captain's voice returned overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now cleared for takeoff. Thank you for your patience. But no one was waiting anymore. Because the flight that mattered had already taken off. Owen looked out the window as the runway stretched ahead. And in that final moment before liftoff, he thought of every time he'd swallowed his discomfort, every time he'd chosen silence over confrontation, every time his skin had spoken before his voice. But not today. Today, he had made them look. Not just at him, but at themselves. As the plane rose into the pale morning sky, a sense of clarity settled across the cabin. Not peace. Not yet. But awareness. And that was a beginning. 3 days later. At a press conference broadcast nationwide, Royal Crest Airlines introduced a new initiative, bias-free cabin. Every seat has a story. They didn't lead with their CEO. They didn't start with an apology. They started with a video. A still frame of Owen, sitting quietly in 2A, reading. Then the slap. The silence. The walk. The return. The voice. Then came the statement, not from the airline's PR director, not from legal. From Owen. Standing on the stage in a charcoal hoodie and white sneakers, he didn't read from a script. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he said. "I'm here because this isn't about me. It's about every person who sat quietly while being judged. Every bystander who meant no harm but caused it anyway. Every person who was made to feel out of place in a place they'd earned." He paused. "They asked if I'd like the woman removed from the airline permanently. I said no. Not because I forgive easily, but because I believe change matters more than punishment. She chose silence when she had power. I chose to speak when I had none. And now, maybe the balance can begin to shift." Reporters didn't interrupt. They didn't shout questions. They listened. Because this was no longer a story about a boy kicked from first class. It was a story about how we define who belongs and who we allow to be pushed aside. 6 months later, Owen sat in a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn. No cameras. No press. Just him, a book, and a window. Outside, life moved as usual. But inside, the barista approached quietly. A young black woman with locks tucked into a hair wrap. "You're Owen, right?" she asked, gently. "I just wanted to say, thanks." "For what?" he said, smiling. "For showing what quiet can sound like when it refuses to disappear." He nodded once. And when she walked away, he opened his phone. No messages. No buzz. Just silence. This time, the good kind. A seat. A story. A shift. And a boy who simply sat where he belonged until the world was forced to see that he did. The end.